Imagine this. You're a seasoned pilot, gearing up for a high-stakes mission over enemy territory. You've been trained for this, maneuvering through dangerous skies, avoiding enemy aircraft, and dodging anti-aircraft fire. But now, you're told that your trusty fighter plane is getting a new addition. It's a drop tank, an extra fuel tank attached to the wing, bulging out like a strange appendage. And it's not just any addition, it's a game changer. Or so they say. At first glance, these drop tanks seem like a terrible idea. They're bulky, awkward, and they disrupt the sleek lines of your aircraft. But as it turns out, these seemingly unwanted tanks would soon be the key to one of the most daring feats of World War II. The first successful attacks on Berlin. It's hard to believe, right? Pilots who despised the very thing that made their missions possible until it turned the tide of war. The drop tanks weren't just an extra weight on the wings, they were a lifeline, a tool that transformed the limitations of fighter aircraft into a weapon capable of reaching enemy heartlands. But before they could be accepted, pilots had to confront their fears, frustrations, and reluctance. And as you'll see, this once-hated innovation would eventually make missions over Berlin not only possible, but essential. Let's dive into the history behind these tanks, the challenges pilots faced, and how the drop tank went from a hated burden to a vital asset. Because sometimes, the tools we fear most are the ones that change the game completely. The early years of World War II were a battle for control of the skies. Fighter aircraft were essential for air superiority, but one problem loomed large: range. Aircraft that were built for speed and agility had limited fuel capacity, which restricted their ability to fly deep into enemy territory and carry out strategic bombing runs. This was especially true for the Allies, who were facing the might of Germany's air defenses. Enter the drop tank, an invention that would revolutionize air combat. The concept behind the drop tank was simple but effective: an external fuel tank that could be attached to the wings of a fighter plane, extending its range for long-haul missions. These tanks were essentially giant, streamlined fuel cans that could be jettisoned once they were empty, allowing the aircraft to return to base without carrying the extra weight. While the concept was brilliant, the execution was anything but. Pilots, who had trained for years in sleek, maneuverable fighters, now found themselves saddled with bulky, clumsy fuel tanks strapped to their planes. The tanks were not only awkward in appearance, but also problematic in terms of performance. They altered the plane's handling, affecting its balance and making it harder to fly. Pilots were concerned that these tanks would make them vulnerable, unable to execute evasive maneuvers in tight dogfights or avoid the high-speed chases that defined aerial combat. Despite these reservations, the need for longer-range aircraft became undeniable. The Allies were determined to reach deeper into enemy territory, particularly to carry out strikes on Germany itself. But without drop tanks, reaching targets like Berlin would be impossible for the fighters of the time. In essence, the drop tank was born out of necessity, not out of any desire for convenience or improved performance. It was a compromise, a tool designed to make a critical mission possible, even if it wasn't the most popular solution. Though the drop tank wasn't yet widely accepted, it marked a turning point. For the first time, pilots had the chance to fly farther, reach more dangerous targets, and strike at the heart of Nazi-controlled Europe. But it was also the beginning of a tough journey, one where these seemingly awkward additions to their planes would become the very thing that made their long-range bombing raids a reality. The next step in this story would be the pilots' initial reactions, the skepticism, the complaints, and the surprising challenges they'd face once they took to the skies with these fuel tanks attached. But despite the resistance, the need for innovation in aerial warfare was clear. And so, the journey of the drop tanks continued. By the time the drop tanks were introduced, the battle for control of the skies was already a brutal and critical aspect of World War II. The Allied forces were locked in an intense struggle to gain air superiority over Nazi Germany, and to do so, they needed every advantage they could get. Fighter aircraft had become the primary tool for this air supremacy, but their effectiveness was limited by their range. While fighters could easily handle patrols over friendly territory, reaching the heart of Germany or even launching precision attacks on industrial centers required more distance than most planes could manage. At this point, missions like those targeting key German cities were limited to bombers that could carry out the long-haul trips, but they lacked the agility to fend off enemy fighters. Fighters, on the other hand, could engage in dogfights and protect bombers in closer proximity to Allied territory. But they were too restricted in range to be effective for deep strikes. This led to a frustrating stalemate where neither bombers nor fighters could fully capitalize on each other's strengths. In 1940, the need for longer-range fighter aircraft became undeniably clear. Germany's growing air defense systems, combined with the effectiveness of Luftwaffe fighter squadrons, meant that any attempts to attack deep into German territory had to be well-planned and executed under the cover of Allied air superiority. But to reach Berlin, to carry out precise strikes on German industrial hubs or military installations, pilots would have to go farther than ever before and do so with less than ideal aircraft. That's where the drop tanks came in. These tanks allowed Allied fighters to fly deep into enemy territory, stretching their operational range far beyond what was originally possible. The drop tanks made it feasible to consider long-range strikes into Germany's heartland, including the vital mission of bombing Berlin. Yet, while the need for these extended-range capabilities was clear, it was still met with hesitation and skepticism among pilots. Many pilots still clung to the belief that carrying these tanks was a disadvantage. The added fuel was bulky and awkward, and the tanks made their planes less maneuverable. The tanks themselves were often a source of anxiety. What would happen if they failed to detach? What if the extra weight affected their ability to perform evasive maneuvers in the event of an attack? The idea of carrying these tanks felt like a compromise, an uncomfortable necessity, not an ideal solution. And yet, in the face of increasing pressure to reach deep into enemy territory, there was no other viable option. As the Allies made their plans for deeper, more daring raids, the drop tanks slowly became an unavoidable part of their arsenal. The initial resistance was strong, but with the realization that their missions were impossible without these tanks, pilots began to prepare for a new kind of warfare, one where air superiority depended not just on skill and speed, but on endurance. The drop tanks represented this shift, and soon these once-hated pieces of equipment would make the impossible possible, enabling pilots to attack Berlin and change the course of the war forever. When the first batch of drop tanks was introduced to Allied pilots, the response was less than enthusiastic. These external fuel tanks, intended to extend the range of fighter aircraft, were met with immediate skepticism, confusion, and even outright disdain. Pilots who had spent years mastering their aircraft and relying on their nimbleness were now forced to contend with something that felt more like a hindrance than a help. The tanks were large, awkward, and attached to the wings of the fighters, fundamentally altering the plane's performance. The main concern, at first, was simple. The tanks affected the aircraft's balance. Fighter planes were designed for agility, speed, and quick reflexes. The addition of bulky drop tanks disrupted this delicate equilibrium, making the planes feel sluggish and cumbersome. In the air, this made maneuvering more difficult, especially in combat scenarios where quick, sharp turns could mean the difference between life and death. Pilots were concerned that the tanks would hinder their ability to evade enemy fire or outmaneuver enemy aircraft during a dogfight, which was a significant part of their training and skill set. Another issue was psychological. Flying with drop tanks meant carrying extra weight and a sense of vulnerability. Many pilots dreaded the thought of having to jettison the tanks in the heat of battle. If the tanks didn't detach properly, it could lead to catastrophic consequences. There was also the matter of the tanks themselves. The sloshing of fuel inside created a constant reminder of their weight and danger. Pilots feared that the tanks could destabilize the aircraft, making it harder to regain control if something went wrong in a high-pressure situation. The tanks were also seen as a potential liability during attacks. Pilots were used to the idea of stripping their aircraft of unnecessary weight to increase speed and maneuverability during combat. The drop tanks, however, would not just weigh the plane down. They would stick around for much of the mission, only being discarded once the fuel was used up. The extra burden raised doubts about their utility, and many pilots were openly vocal about their frustrations. This skepticism was compounded by the fact that the drop tanks were not seen as a clever innovation. They were a desperate solution to a pressing problem. Pilots were not looking for a new tool to improve their performance, they were simply being handed something they had no real interest in. The tanks were being pushed on them because they were necessary for long-range missions, not because anyone had asked for them or seen them as an improvement. And yet, despite the widespread disapproval, there was no escaping the reality. The tanks were here to stay. The need for long-range capabilities had become undeniable. Missions to penetrate deeper into German airspace, particularly to carry out raids over Berlin, required more fuel. Without drop tanks, these missions simply wouldn't be feasible. The pilots could complain, resist, and even curse the tanks all they wanted, but their value, whether they liked it or not, was about to be proven in the air. Soon, the very tool they had hated would prove to be the lifeline they needed. However, to get to that point, the pilots had to first get past their fears and misgivings and adapt to this new form of aerial combat. It was a change that would ultimately reshape the nature of their missions and the course of the war. As the war raged on, the need for deep strikes into German territory became more urgent. The strategic importance of targeting Berlin and other vital Nazi strongholds was clear, but the problem remained. How could the Allies carry out these long-range missions with fighter planes that lacked the necessary fuel capacity to make such trips? The solution, whether pilots liked it or not, was the drop tank. And while pilots may have initially resisted the change, necessity was about to force them to rethink their positions. The turning point came as Allied commanders realized that without the ability to launch long-range strikes, their bombing campaigns would remain ineffective. The Luftwaffe's air defenses were formidable. And even with heavy bombers, deep penetrations into German airspace were far too risky without adequate fighter escort. Without the range to protect the bombers for the entire journey, the mission would fail. In essence, the drop tank was no longer just a convenience, it was a critical requirement for the success of these raids. The drop tanks, despite their initial awkwardness, were now essential for Allied fighters to escort bombers far behind enemy lines. The added fuel allowed fighter pilots to push deeper into enemy territory, escorting bombers to their targets and engaging enemy aircraft in ways they hadn't been able to before. The first tests of this new capability were met with mixed results, but the potential of the drop tank was undeniable. It gave the Allied fighters the one thing they had lacked: the ability to fly far enough to reach Berlin. The shift from seeing the drop tanks as a nuisance to understanding them as a tool of necessity was gradual but undeniable. The initial complaints and reluctance didn't disappear overnight, but as pilots began to carry out missions that would have otherwise been impossible, the value of the drop tank started to become clear. This shift was not just about the technology, it was about the evolving mindset of the pilots who were now forced to adapt. The once hated drop tank was no longer a burden. It was the key to breaking through Germany's defenses. In practice, the use of drop tanks led to significant innovations in flight tactics. Pilots had to adjust their flying style to compensate for the tank's weight and altered balance. But this led to a new type of aerial strategy. Longer flights meant more time to plan and engage with enemy targets, while the ability to fly deeper into enemy airspace opened up new possibilities for offensive operations. The drop tanks gave pilots a new kind of freedom, one they had not previously enjoyed. And then came the game changer: the ability to reach Berlin itself. The drop tanks, which had been the source of so much frustration, now enabled Allied pilots to fly deep into Nazi-held territory and execute some of the most daring and important raids of the war. The first successful strikes on Berlin were not just a symbolic victory, they were a strategic milestone that marked the turning point in the Allied campaign. For the first time, the Allies had the capability to directly strike at the heart of Nazi Germany from the skies. The drop tank had turned from a hated appendage to an indispensable tool. The very piece of equipment that had been met with resistance and skepticism had now become central to the Allied war effort. It wasn't just about fuel anymore. It was about access, mobility, and the ability to shift the balance of power in the skies. The necessity of these tanks had led to the innovation and adaptation that had enabled the Allies to take the fight to Berlin. And what followed would shock everyone because the real impact of the drop tank was just beginning to be felt. In the context of World War II, the significance of Berlin was undeniable. It wasn't just the capital of Nazi Germany, it was the heart of the war machine. Striking Berlin was more than just a symbolic victory. It was a direct assault on the core of the enemy's power. However, up until the introduction of the drop tank, such a mission seemed almost impossible for fighter aircraft. The distance was too great, and the risks too high. Yet, with the drop tank in place, Allied pilots could now take on the most formidable target of all, Berlin itself. The strategic importance of bombing Berlin cannot be overstated. As the war progressed, Germany's ability to wage war depended heavily on its industrial centers, particularly in Berlin. By targeting these centers, the Allies hoped to disrupt German production and weaken the Nazi regime's grip on power. However, the question remained: how could fighters reach such a well-defended city, deep within enemy territory, without the necessary fuel and range? The answer lay in the drop tanks, which extended the range of Allied fighters just enough to make a successful strike possible. In the early days of the war, Berlin was considered nearly invulnerable from the air. The Luftwaffe's air defenses were formidable, and Allied aircraft simply didn't have the range to carry out strikes deep into German territory without refueling or the risk of running out of fuel mid-flight. The idea of bombing Berlin seemed like a distant dream, but the introduction of the drop tank made that dream a reality. It enabled fighter planes to fly further, escort bombers to their targets, and engage enemy fighters in crucial dogfights over German soil. For the pilots, the mission to bomb Berlin was nothing short of terrifying. The drop tanks, once seen as a nuisance, now became the key to the mission's success. But even with the tanks, there were still countless risks. The distance meant the planes would be operating at the limits of their fuel capacity, and the defenses around Berlin were more formidable than ever. There was also the issue of jettisoning the drop tanks at the right moment. Any delay in releasing the tanks could leave the planes with unnecessary weight, further limiting their maneuverability in enemy territory. And yet, despite all the risks, the mission was a success. The first successful bombing raids over Berlin were a game-changer. For the first time, Allied pilots were able to strike deep into the heart of Nazi-controlled Europe. These raids were not just about disrupting enemy infrastructure, they were a statement of intent. Berlin, the seemingly impenetrable capital of the Nazi regime, had been reached. And the Allies had done it with a tool they had once despised. The drop tanks had proven their worth, not only as a fuel source, but as a symbol of adaptation and resilience. These tanks, which had once been viewed with suspicion and disdain, had become the key to a new phase in the war. For the pilots, they represented the hard-earned reality that necessity often breeds innovation. They had hated them at first, but now they saw the tanks for what they truly were, the lifeline that made the impossible possible. And with Berlin within reach, the war would never be the same. The ability to bomb Berlin had not only shifted the balance of the war, but had also begun to shift the mindset of the pilots. They no longer saw the drop tanks as an inconvenience. Instead, they saw them as a critical tool for achieving their goals and striking at the heart of the enemy. The drop tank, once despised, had transformed into the weapon that made the mission possible. And with Berlin now on the map, the Allies had taken a giant leap forward in their quest to defeat Nazi Germany. The introduction of drop tanks did more than just change the range of fighter planes, it transformed the entire nature of aerial warfare. Before the tanks, fighter aircraft were confined to relatively short-range missions, mostly engaging in dogfights or protecting bombers within a limited radius from base. However, the ability to carry additional fuel on board and extend the range of fighters meant that air forces could conduct offensive operations on an entirely new scale. Missions previously thought to be impossible became a reality, and the tactical landscape of aerial warfare was forever altered. Before drop tanks, fighters had to rely on their base of operations for refueling. The farther the target, the less effective the fighters became. Even escorting bombers deep into enemy territory was a challenge, as the fighters often didn't have enough fuel to engage in combat and then return to base. This made precision raids and deep strikes into places like Berlin nearly unfeasible. Drop tanks solved this problem by giving fighters the endurance they needed to go the distance. They could now fly farther, engage the enemy, and then return to safety without having to worry about running out of fuel halfway through a mission. With the added fuel, pilots had more time and room to strategize during missions. They no longer had to worry about running low on fuel when approaching enemy defenses or trying to protect bombers over hostile territory. The tactical possibilities for fighters expanded, allowing them to participate in missions deep behind enemy lines and provide critical support for long-range bombing campaigns. This shift had a profound impact on the Allied offensive against Germany and set the stage for even more aggressive tactics in the years to come. But it wasn't just about range. Drop tanks also brought new challenges that required pilots to adapt their strategies. Pilots had to change their approach to combat and adjust their tactics to account for the extra weight and altered balance of the planes. The additional weight of the tanks could slow the aircraft's acceleration, make it harder to maneuver quickly, and affect the overall handling during dogfights. To deal with this, pilots had to refine their skills and become even more strategic in how they used their planes. In many cases, this meant rethinking old dogfighting tactics and developing new ones that made the most of the aircraft's extended range while mitigating the impact of the tanks. As pilots became more accustomed to flying with drop tanks, they found ways to incorporate them into their missions more seamlessly. What had once been a disruptive addition was now integrated into the very fabric of their operations. Fighters could execute long-range escort missions with bombers, engage enemy aircraft over increasingly distant targets, and perform precision strikes at key Nazi facilities. What had seemed like an awkward and uncomfortable addition now became a vital part of the toolkit that allowed Allied air forces to expand their reach and effectiveness. Beyond just tactical shifts, the introduction of drop tanks also signaled a broader evolution in the role of fighter aircraft. Fighters were no longer just tools for protecting bombers or engaging in short skirmishes with enemy aircraft. With the ability to reach deeper into enemy territory, fighter planes became key players in the strategic offensive against Nazi Germany. They weren't just weapons of defense, they were now offensive tools, capable of striking at the heart of enemy territory and disrupting the German war machine. The impact of the drop tank on aerial warfare was not just a matter of increasing range. It also marked a shift in how military forces viewed the role of fighter aircraft, leading to more ambitious and far-reaching strategies. Pilots and commanders alike had to adapt to new possibilities, changing their mindset from defensive to offensive operations. The tanks themselves, once seen as a burden, were now seen as an essential tool in turning the tide of the war. In a way, the drop tank became symbolic of the entire Allied strategy, necessity driving innovation. What was once an unwelcome addition to a fighter aircraft became the key to pushing the boundaries of what was possible in the air. By embracing the challenges and adapting to the new realities, pilots were able to help change the course of the war and redefine the nature of aerial warfare. With drop tanks, the sky was no longer the limit, it was the battlefield. For many pilots, the introduction of drop tanks represented a stark departure from the sleek, agile fighters they had trained to fly. Initially, the tanks were a source of frustration, anxiety, and resistance. Pilots who had spent years mastering their planes were suddenly faced with a new, unwelcome challenge. The drop tanks added weight, altered the aircraft's balance, and compromised their ability to perform in combat situations. To many, they felt like a betrayal of the fighter's core design. A machine built for speed, agility, and precision, now burdened with an awkward and cumbersome appendage. But as the war progressed and the need for deep, long-range missions became more pressing, pilots began to face a difficult truth. These tanks were essential for the success of their missions. It wasn't just about completing bombing raids, it was about surviving and winning. The tanks allowed Allied fighters to travel deeper into enemy territory, strike at key targets, and support bombing missions over Berlin. In short, they allowed the pilots to do the very thing they had been trained for, win the war just in a new, less comfortable way. Over time, This realization began to sink in. As pilots carried out more and more missions with the drop tanks, they started to accept the tanks as a necessary part of their aircraft. It wasn't that the tanks became any less unwieldy or frustrating to work with. Rather, pilots grew to appreciate the capabilities they afforded. They understood that without the tanks, many of the most important missions, particularly those over enemy strongholds like Berlin, simply wouldn't have been possible. They were no longer a nuisance, but a tool that made deep strikes into Nazi territory feasible. This shift in perspective didn't happen overnight. The transition from resentment to acceptance was gradual, and many pilots still carried a deep sense of unease about the tanks. There was always the risk that something would go wrong. The tanks might not release properly, the extra fuel could destabilize the aircraft, or the weight could leave them vulnerable during dogfights. Yet, as the Allies began to see more success with their missions and achieved critical victories over German targets, the tanks became less of a source of frustration and more of a symbol of adaptation and resilience. In a sense, the psychological shift from hate to acceptance mirrored the broader transformation of the war itself. Just as the drop tanks were initially seen as a compromise and necessity, the Allies had to adapt and innovate in response to the ever-changing dynamics of the conflict. The war was constantly evolving, and new challenges like the need to reach Berlin required new solutions. The drop tanks, while not perfect, became the solution that allowed pilots to push the boundaries of what was possible in the air. Pilots who once cursed the drop tanks began to recognize that they were an essential part of their success. They weren't just carrying extra weight, they were carrying the potential to reach deeper into enemy territory, to strike with greater precision, and to turn the tide of the war. The psychological shift wasn't just about accepting the tanks, it was about realizing their true value. What had once been a hindrance had become a lifeline. And in time, pilots would look at the tanks not with disdain, but with a grudging respect for the role they played in achieving Allied victories. The journey from hatred to acceptance was a microcosm of the larger story of innovation and adaptation that defined much of World War II. The tools and technologies that pilots and soldiers once resisted, whether out of fear, skepticism, or discomfort, often turned out to be the very tools that enabled them to achieve victory. The drop tanks were no exception. Through necessity and psychological growth, they transformed from a hated addition to an indispensable asset, shaping the way Allied forces fought and ultimately contributing to the defeat of Nazi Germany. As the war continued and Allied forces pushed deeper into Nazi-controlled territory, the role of the drop tank became increasingly clear. What had once been an unwelcome, awkward addition to fighter aircraft evolved into one of the most vital innovations of the conflict. The drop tank was not just a tool for extending the range of fighters, it became a symbol of adaptability, resilience, and the relentless drive to overcome the challenges of warfare. Pilots who initially hated the tanks for their perceived limitations and discomfort eventually learned to embrace them as a necessary and life-saving asset. Without the drop tanks, missions to strike Berlin and other key German targets would have remained out of reach. The ability to fly long distances into the heart of enemy territory was a game-changer, allowing the Allies to carry out precision raids that disrupted German war production and crippled the Nazi regime's ability to continue its fight. The shift from resistance to acceptance wasn't just a matter of adapting to new technology, it was a psychological transformation. The same pilots who once viewed the tanks as a burden began to see them for what they truly were, a critical tool that allowed them to carry out their missions and ultimately help win the war. Through necessity, these once hated devices became indispensable, proving that sometimes the greatest innovations come not from the perfect design, but from the relentless drive to solve an urgent problem. The drop tank's legacy endures not just in its technical contribution to aviation, but in the lessons it taught, that the road to success is often paved with unexpected innovations, and that the things we fear or resist most can sometimes turn out to be the very things that shape our future. In the case of the drop tank, what was initially viewed as a hindrance became one of the most pivotal advancements in aerial warfare, a testament to the power of necessity driving innovation. As we look back on those daring missions over Berlin and beyond, we are reminded that in war, as in life, Progress often comes through adaptation, and victory can be achieved when we learn to embrace the challenges that seem insurmountable. The drop tanks, once despised by pilots, proved to be a game-changing force in the fight for air superiority, turning a hated invention into a vital asset that helped bring about the downfall of Nazi Germany.